Hello, I'm Sarah Clarke and you're joining us at FundForum Asia 2017 in Hong Kong at the JW Marriott. Now, in one of our first keynote interviews this morning, we've had Dr. Parag Khanna. He's a leading global strategist and world traveller. He's also a best-selling author. He's also a Senior Research Fellow in the Centre in Asia and Globalisation at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Khanna, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's start with one of your key points here. We're talking about connectivity. Can you define what this is and why it's so important?
Yeah, connectivity is what makes the world go round. Connectivity is literally how our markets, our economies, our societies are able to trade with each other, invest in each other, exchange data, goods, services. All of the flows of people, of talent, knowledge, rest on some form of connectivity. There are three kinds of infrastructures that underpin that connectivity: transportation, energy, communications, all the pipelines, internet cables, railways, airports. All of those infrastructures promote the integration of our economies, of our markets. They allow us to participate in a world governed by supply and demand, where we can sell goods and exchange goods and services with people everywhere, and that rests on connectivity. My argument is that we need to invest so much more in this connectivity asset class or classes than we have to date. And indeed, I would say global investment in infrastructure is about $4 trillion a year. It should be about $8 trillion a year.
Okay, you mentioned Asia as being a bright spot, but you also mentioned it's got a lot more potential. There's a lot more to do.
Yes.
What does it need to do, and what kind of investment is required?
Right. Let's remember the scale of Asia. We're talking about most of the world's population, more than almost 5 billion people, many of whom, billions of whom, are still not yet sufficiently connected. We look at the shining, gleaming megacities like Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta, Shanghai, Singapore, and so forth, all the way down to Sydney and Tokyo, but billions of people don't live in those cities, right? So there's disconnected populations. We're not making the most of the Asian opportunity, even as Asia is leading the world in growth. We still have many second-tier cities, third-tier cities in Indonesia, in the Philippines, across peninsular Southeast Asia, Western China, South Asia, much of South Asia. Those populations are still not well connected. So they need the kind of basic infrastructures, they need the digital infrastructures, they need the financial connectivity. All of those things are necessary if we want to see the region as a whole grow, we want to see more consumers, we want to see an economic transformation.
Okay, so who is leading that expansionist movement in Asia? Which country?
It's a great point. So for one thing, of course, Japan already has the world's leading fixed capital formation, such a high quality infrastructure, such a financialized economy, such a universal participation in the digital side of life and the financial side of life. Now we're starting to see that happen in China so much. That leapfrog has happened in China because of digitization, right? People who've been bypassing, in a way, the formal banking sector and moving into Alipay and even buying financial products through online. India has a long way to go. Southeast Asia is growing very quickly. It's not just the investment that any one country is doing inwardly, it's now the spread of those companies. We now see the Chinese sort of dot-com stars investing now hugely in India. We see Chinese companies like Tencent and so forth moving into Southeast Asia. So this cross-border, the Rakuten financed companies and SoftBank financed Japanese companies that are expanding in the region. So it's the interpenetration of Asian technology firms that is helping to reach these billions of untapped people.
Okay, taking it to more of a global perspective, you mentioned economic openness, the removal of borders and territories. Looking at the region, we've got North Korea, we've got China and the US, the likes of Trump talking Buy America, and you mentioned that the expansionist movement globally and the connectivity. But how can this be the case in the current climate? How important, is this political trend, and how will it impact on the region?
It's a great point. So remember, the baseline is that Asia has been integrating. Let's remember that even with the failure of TPP, which the US is no longer participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations, the Asian countries are moving forward with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific. So the headline story is still increasing supply chain integration. There is what I call the tug of war, the competition over those value chains between countries. That is, of course, the case as their companies struggle, as they use industrial policy and soft protectionism to try and keep and retain, sort of wealth and production within their borders. But still, despite that friction, there's enormous growth in the flows. So yes, you have isolated pockets of volatility, unrest, nationalism, populism, instability, the North Koreas of the world. But North Korea does not exactly define Asia. It is a fringe phenomenon. And Trump has really dialed down his rhetoric too. He's not talking about a global trade war. He's talking about incrementally trying to correct certain massive US bilateral trade deficits, which is a smart thing for an American leader to be saying, quite frankly. So I don't see a big trade war. I see Asia being somewhat exposed in terms of exports to the US, but I don't see those exports dropping to zero. And most importantly, again, the proof is that Asia's economies have been integrating, and Asian trade within Asia is greater than Asia's dependence on trade with Europe and the United States.
Okay, my last question. Who is going to profit most from this global connectivity? Which funds and companies? Can you identify?
It's a great point. So within every sector, there are those conduits of connectivity, whether it is the energy companies that are building the pipeline infrastructures, whether it is the technology companies that are laying the fiber optics, whether it is the telecoms that are providing those services, or whether it is the banks that are getting those cross-border licenses to start to operate in new and frontier markets and start to be part of the growth in the commercial and retail sectors in those countries. All of those sectors have players, companies within them, that are focusing on being the conduits of connectivity, reaching large populations, and being sort of, if you will, being the element of liquidity for future growth. So I see companies from all over the world participating in that. The smart Western companies are doing it, the smart Asian companies are doing it as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khanna, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we have time for this particular interview, but you can follow us on Twitter. Just look for #FFAsia. Goodbye for now.